Okay, good afternoon and thank you all for attending Spearfish Security webinar on risk profiling. Just a little admin before we get started. As we have so many attendees this afternoon, I would ask if you could stay off camera and turn off your microphone to mute unless one of the speakers asks you to take part in the discussion. We will be taking questions at the end of the presentation, but if you have any questions, please feel free to put into the chat box as and when you think of it, and we'll do our best to make sure it's answered at the end. Tara, one of our panelists, will be putting out some polling throughout the presentation, so please take part. And it would be really interesting to see what those outcomes might be. You'll find this link to the poll in the chat box. Finally, we will be recording this webinar and we'll send a link round for you all to share via email or on your social media platforms. And we'll put out my contact details later in the chat. So before I introduce this afternoon's panel, I just wanted to let you know a little bit about us. For those who are not familiar with us, Spearfish has been working for over 12 years, developing our bespoke services and tools, which enable organizations and NGOs to reduce risk, meet duty of care and safeguarding standards to their team. We do this through our four main services: crisis response, consultancy, Overwatch, and more recently, our online duty of care centre. We understand that every organisation has a different level of and appetite for risk. We work with our clients to determine what that level is and build a framework around it, utilising a combination of data analysis and our regional security advisors, who are not only security and duty of care experts, but also regional and country experts on the ground. We primarily work in sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia, and in 2018 opened our subsidiary office in Abuja. This afternoon, our panel will be discussing risk profiling as part of an individual's duty of care operating in a complex environment. First up, we have Tara Arthur, who recently published a paper with GISF on the impact of race, ethnicity, and nationality on aid workers' security. Followed by our Managing Director, Dan Hooton, who will be looking at risk profiling from a security management perspective. And last, but by no means least, we are very lucky to welcome Kabir Domu onto the panel. Kabir is one of Nigeria's leading subject matter experts on security and will be talking to us today about risk profiling, looking specifically at Northwest and Northeast Nigeria. Before I hand you over to Tara, a short introduction. Tara joined Global Interagency Security Forum in 2019 and serves as their Senior Projects and Memberships Officer. Based in the US, Tara has over 10 years experience in the development and humanitarian space. She has served in various capacities, including programs, safety and security and advocacy, both at country and headquarter level. She holds a BA in political science and an MA in international development and social change. In her role, she is responsible for fostering GISF member engagement and developing member services, including members forums, workshops, webinars, podcasts, and more. Tara, I hand it over to you.
Thank you, Rosie, and thank you, Spearfish, for this opportunity to speak with you all today. I'll go ahead and start with the poll. I'm going to put the link in the chat. If you don't mind finding your way to that link, and just feel free to answer the questions as you see fit. I will share the results in a moment, but before we get there, just feel free to add any thoughts or points you might have to those questions as we get going. So we'll give it a few minutes and maybe we can come back to that towards the end. Oh, we're getting some in now. Let me go ahead and share my screen. 1 second. Can you see it? Are you able to see my screen?
Yeah, all good.
Yeah, we can see
All right.
that.
We'll talk more about this in a few minutes, but continue to add your inputs here. And there's a second question as well. So as I continue on with the presentation, we'll come back and have a look at these. So Rosie, I don't know if you can put my presentation back. Apologies.
There we go. Is that back up?
That's back. Thank you. So as mentioned, my name is Tara Arthur, and I'm the Senior Projects and Membership Officer with GISF, which is formerly the European Interagency Security Forum. And we're a member-led NGO that drives change through our global network of over 130 member organizations. And we influence good security risk management practice that works for the whole humanitarian sector, improving the security of aid workers and operations for sustainable access. And so GSF is committed to achieving sustainable access to populations in need and keeping aid workers safe. And we drive positive change in humanitarian security risk management through our original research, collaboration, and events. And for us, humanitarian describes not-for-profit activities that seek to improve lives and reduce suffering. And so myself and my colleague Leah Mutar were pleased to work on this article toward inclusive security risk management, the impact of race, ethnicity, and nationality on aid workers' security. And I'm here today, as mentioned, to share some highlights with you, but also to really kind of look more closely at risk profiling. So next slide, please. So I'll start here. We recognize that the issues surrounding race, ethnicity, and nationality have been a topic in the aid community in particular and surrounding communities for some time. However, it was particularly poignant that after the death of George Floyd, that we found ourselves attending many meetings, conferences, and engagements where the impact of racism on aid workers were being discussed, along with the need to create safe spaces. However, the link with physical security was rarely, if ever, mentioned, nor was a topic of literal safe spaces, which was a bit troubling. So when we started to conceive the article and look around to see if there were answers to some of the questions we had, we barely found any articles that specifically spoke about security and racism together. There were a few testimonies that called out organizations for not protecting staff of color, especially national staff, to the same extent as their white expat colleagues. And there's been some great articles, and on one in particular, a great article was debating the issues associated to profiling, but no direct research focusing on this and linking it with racism. So within security risk management, we know that there's progress being made on inclusive approaches. The security of women, LGBTQ+ people, and sometimes they were more often discussed and addressed. But rarely were we hearing about special arrangements to tackle race, ethnicity, and nationality. So we knew it was taken into account to some extent, as we also know that, some white international staff wouldn't be deployed to some locations. But what was going on behind the scenes? What was discussed and what wasn't being discussed? So next slide, please. So let's hit on a couple of key concepts about the paper. Some of this will help kind of frame the foundation of what we'll talk about today. So in the paper, we use the term race in quotation marks to highlight its socially constructed nature. I won't be doing that during the event, but I do want to remind you of this emphasis. This is because it doesn't reflect any biological reality and is very much a social construct. Like other terms in the article as well, but race can be more controversial for some. Another key concept emphasized is an intersectional approach, where race, ethnicity, and nationality are focused on in the paper, but also essential are the many intersections with other characteristics. So that's an important one to keep in mind as we go further in today's conversation. So racism here is broken down into 4 parts: internalized biases, which are owned by the individuals; interpersonal, which show up in behaviors and the actions of individuals; institutional, which may be found in policies or programs that work to the benefit of some, but the detriment of others; structural, racial biases that present across institutions in society; created by the interplay of policies, laws, and practices which support and perpetuate inequalities between different groups based on race. So we define racism in this case as prejudice, discrimination, or antagonism directed against someone of a different race based on the belief that one's own race is superior. Racism is founded on a historical power relationship and includes certain ideologies about race. It's operationalized through forms and practices of discrimination. And you can learn more about this and how we talk about it in the paper including related citations,
You can take them out of that place.
which we can share later.
Have you closed that door?
So given the various vulnerabilities, which you can see a little bit more of how we illuminate it in this graphic, but given different various vulnerabilities and positions with regards to the context of operation, different security rules often apply to national and international staff in their day-to-day work life or situations of emergencies. So for example, security briefings, restrictions on movements, the type of transports used, access to evacuation, etc. While some differences seem justified and are commonly accepted, others are less so. So we know that national staff usually receive less training, livelihood benefits, security provisions, psychosocial support compared to their expatriate colleagues. So the statistics on national staff security incidents, the testimonies collected, and the interviews conducted in this research all question whether the risks faced by national staff, and especially staff of color, are taken as seriously as those faced by white staff. So the boundaries between the different categories of staff can be complex. It's generally preferable to refer to the specific situation of a staff member and, for instance, differentiate between locally hired staff who are hired and work in the same region they come from, and nationally relocated staff who work in their country of origin, but in a different region than the one they might have grown up in. And it's important to remember that other situations can blur the lines between national and international staff categories. For example, staff who hold different or dual citizenships. If an individual with dual citizenship is contracted as a national staff member, they may be perceived differently by security managers, and they may not be able to access certain security measures as a national staff member. And they may be perceived differently by security managers themselves, and they may not be able to access some of those security measures, such as evacuation in case of emergency. So in the private sector, some of these terms may vary, but the principles of perceived hierarchy are still important. So next slide, please. Next slide, Rosie. Sorry.
Next one. That one?
That one. Yep, thank you. So NGO's intentional use of diverse profiles and its security implications, while taking into account that the intersectional identity of staff can be positive for both staff and operations, these practices can be harmful. The current use of specific profiles for security risk management by NGOs further raises questions around the transfer of risks towards specific staff members. So let's take, for instance, one in which organizations use staff profiles as a risk mitigation strategy in and of itself without developing adequate security measures to address the remaining risks staff may face. That's more harmful. So for example, you send a staff member to X country because they will easily blend in, versus when an organization uses staff profiles to better understand the risks different individuals face and develop adequate measures to mitigate them. That's more useful. So it's important to note that in practice, the situation is not always clear-cut. Some organizations select staff based on their profiles to mitigate the risk, and at the same time, put in place the measures to address the residual risk they may still face. However, in the interviews conducted and in other articles, this is not always the norm. Staff of a certain ethnicity, nationality, or race may be deployed within the assumption, for example, and sometimes correct assumption, that they're less likely to be kidnapped than their white Western colleagues. However, these identity traits do not mitigate the risk of a terrorist attack, an aerial bombing, the explosion of IEDs, or indiscriminate shooting at convoys, which are likely to exist in the context where kidnapping is a viable threat. In many cases, security plans may not effectively consider nor mitigate these or other threats to the same extent as they would if white Westerners were part of those operations. Next slide, please. So deploying staff with specific profiles. Selecting aid workers with only specific profiles can reduce team diversity in operations, creating very homogeneous and often very masculine environments, which may impact operations quality and acceptance strategies. So interviews spotlighted a range of different issues within the current organizational practices. For example, when organizations only recruit national staff from a specific ethnicity, this can create tensions with local communities and jeopardize access, as organizations might be perceived to be partial towards a certain ethnic group. While visible identity characteristics inform to a certain extent the risk staff face, they do not predict behaviors. The way staff behave can be the greatest determinant of their security and the operation's success, and these cannot be determined solely based on a staff member's profile. So one interviewee shared the example of a Black Kenyan staff member who kept being sent to different African contexts, as the organization that employed him assumed he would fit in more easily and be more familiar with the African countries. Besides the limited deployment opportunities that were offered to this person, he was not adequately briefed on why he was being sent to some of the contexts and the security risk he might encounter there. So next slide, please. All security managers who were interviewed recognized the importance of diversity for implementing effective security risk management. They highlighted how having a diverse team is key to adequately assessing risk, understanding the threat sources, and how they affect staff with different profiles. Running collective risk assessments and involving staff with diverse profiles at each step of the security risk management process were also seen as the center of modern and person-centered security risk management. A few interviewees shared that they were working with staff holding diversity, equity, inclusion, or DEI or JEDI responsibilities, including HR, to improve their security risk management practices. This collaboration has encouraged the adaptation of security training to ensure staff understand profile-specific risk. In general, interviewees mentioned that it was easier to consider ethnicity, nationality, and racism within the security risk management structure when their organization showed a strong commitment to diversity and anti-racism. While positive practices described in the above section should be celebrated, most interviewees felt that more could be done to ensure staff of color can access equitable security measures. Almost all of them wished they had more resources, time, funding, etc., to develop the person-centered security risk management practices and better address race, ethnicity, and nationality in security. A few interviewees, both staff of color and not, confessed to feeling uncomfortable talking about racism and being afraid to say the wrong thing. Those who were comfortable speaking about these issues still highlighted that it was difficult to bring up such discussions within their organization. Many staff of color feared that they would be ostracized and isolated if they brought up the topic of racism in general, and also in relation to their security. This fear was well-founded, as most of the aid workers of color interviewed shared that they faced repercussions for voicing complaints about racism, which sometimes led to their resignation. Beyond racism, the fear of speaking up can be shared by staff who are in more junior positions or belong to a non-dominant culture or community. A certain lack of diversity was also observed in security roles. Interviewees shared that while many regional and national level security managers are people of color, this is definitely not the case at the global level. And so for security risk management to be truly diverse, inclusive, effective, and sustainable, we have to truly diversify the sector. It's not just, a nice to have, it's a must have. And that piece is quoted from one of the interviewees we had who was a global INGO security advisor. And so I would like to just leave you with that because I'd like to just, maybe take a moment to go back quickly and show you some of the results of the poll, and then I'll hand it back to Rosie.
No worries.
I don't know if it's working. So this was the results of some of the polling you guys had. And these are some of your answers. And I'll stop there and hand it back to you, Rosie.
Okay, thanks, Tara. That's great. Bear with me 1 minute and I will reshare. That was really interesting. Thank you. Okay, so next up, Spearfish's Managing Director, Dan Hooton. So, since leaving the Armed Forces in 2001, Dan has gained a wide experience as consultant, corporate practitioner, and company director. Helping businesses and individuals flourish in high-risk environments has become his speciality, having advised many different organizations on a wide variety of risks. Dan is also the chair of the region of the Risk and Security Management Forum and serves as a trustee of the Future Terrain charity. Dan, I hand it over to you.
Thank you, Rosie. Good afternoon, everyone. Great to see so many friends and colleagues on the call, despite the sweltering temperatures here in the UK. But so far, so good. I'll be coming at this from a security management perspective, i.e. the need to make a judgment on how to keep people safe, typically in a medium to high risk environment. My focus will be on the international development standpoint, which is slightly different to Tara's NGO/aid worker scenario, but I hope my logic carries across. What I'm going to speak about is based on experience that we've developed here at Spearfish. We know it works, but there's always something to improve upon, and I think we are only really scratching the surface in the subject of profiling. And I'm going to focus on 3 key areas: elements to consider, factors to apply, and then methods of profiling. So next slide, please, Rosie. So some elements to consider when profiling. There's no strict definition to this, but what I would say is we might do it slightly differently to other companies, but quite simply, we're trying to build up a picture of you, a traveler, an employee, or someone who we are forming a view on risk for. And we're then trying to place that picture into the context of the risk environment that you are in. And what's important to stress is why we are doing this, i.e. it's on the grounds of safety, and the information will only be used for those purposes. And I think that's really important to get across, particularly when you're asking for more information than people might be used to giving. Some elements Tara has already mentioned, but I just want to give you my views on them. Nationality. So when we look at individuals, of course, there is an inherent bias to focus purely on the international travelers, as if they have a far higher risk exposure. And why is this? Well, it can be down to a number of reasons, but a lot is driven by the security industry itself, who have developed products and techniques over the years and have baked in this approach, rightly or wrongly. What we have seen is that each group may have a different set of risks to manage, but just because you are traveling to a new country, you aren't necessarily at any more risk than those already there. And quite often in our experience, it's the reverse. A Nigerian client driving regularly from Kaduna to Kano might experience a far higher level of risk from kidnap or RTA than an international consultant spending a week in the Sheraton in Abuja, for example. But for those measuring the risk outside the country, this may not be readily apparent. However, COVID-19 travel restrictions and the increased use of local partners and consultants over the last 2 years has brought about a conversion of sorts. We've seen far more clients considering risks to all staff and not just those on the international roster, but it does remain a work in progress. What we need to ensure that this change becomes permanently locked into our discussions on duty of care and that common standards apply across your organization at all levels. Gender-based violence is high on most companies' lists of priorities. And whilst we know its importance, what is less well understood is effective ways to mitigate this, particularly when heading out into the field. And quite often, it's not within the company's ability to completely remove this risk, but it can be avoided by good information and best practice. And this is normally based on a contextual understanding of a community and making plans thereof. From a tactical level, we have to understand what we can and can't change and proceed on that basis. Experience. The actions you take when working the field depends hugely on your experience. and it also includes the knowledge of the areas you're operating in. We need to understand this. Recently, Jacob from our team traveled to Jos in Plateau State in Nigeria to visit 2 local government areas. And what he found out was that whilst he was there, or just before he got there, he found out there were quite significant community tensions and flashpoints along his route and at each destination. And so as a result, he varied his patterns and movements on the ground. And he also timed his visit to coincide with another delegation who was seen as a force for good, to sort of blend in with them. So it's essential to find out a traveler's understanding of these dynamics, which hugely varies the support that they require. And then finally, religion slash ethnicity. And linking on to the above point, it's a simple fact that if I look or behave differently, then I'm going to be noticed. And this could play out in several different ways. Depending on where you are, very much dictates how this will affect you. If I'm in a location where there's a wide variety of people, e.g. a travel hub in Nairobi, for example, then it's not normally going to be a problem. However, when I transit to Mogadishu or perhaps Hargeisa in Somaliland, then I have to understand how my appearance might trigger certain responses from different actors. I also need to understand where there are community tensions. Sending someone from a particular part of the country or even a different state or region may expose them to risk, and this needs to be understood and managed. So what is the point of profiling? Well, of course, it allows you to carry out a more nuanced risk analysis. It makes your work far more effective and credible to the recipient, but it also helps you truly meet your duty of care. It allows you to redefine your risk scenarios for your mission, adjust your probability and impact scores, and develop robust mitigation plans. If I'm assessing the risk of Amit, traveling from New Delhi to Lucknow, as he is today, I'm looking at factors such as his caste, the areas he's driving through, his experience and timings of the trip. And I could extend this to the vehicle that he's traveling in. Is he self-driving or does he have a driver, etc.? So if I can get to the bottom of all of that, I can give a really good appreciation of the risk and work out the best plan. Perhaps just a word on privacy. Privacy concerned individual versus organization. There are legitimate concerns over what a company or consultancy will do with a large amount of personal information. So whatever you do must be controlled in the right manner, be very clearly understood, and people must know what will happen to the information after the mission. Could other areas of the business access it for purposes that stray outside of duty of care? By having a comprehensive engagement process for those undergoing profiling, you can build trust and then deliver a transparent service. A large element of risk communication is built on trust, i.e. you need to be seen as a credible voice, a reliable partner, and that must be maintained at all costs. Next slide, please, Rosie. So other factors to consider. So we've built our profile. We then need to take into account a few other things. The first thing to mention is activity. We often talk about doing no harm when it comes to donor-funded activities, but what does that really mean? If I visit a community, will my presence there create issues for those people after I've gone? How will a permanent team there handle this? And will it create issues for the next traveller in? And these are all questions that need to be answered. Appetite, sometimes referred to as tolerance, there is a question of how much risk an organisation is willing to bear. And this must be aligned with the individual, as sometimes they can be quite different. And it's our job to give a clear-eyed view of what is reasonable to take on. Residual risk will be left after mitigation plans have been developed. And again, that needs to fit in with the expectations for both the organisation and the individual. And then finally, ability, how to handle the risk, experience versus training. What assumptions are we making about the individual and the organization's ability to handle the risk, either due to their training and or experience? And when you dig down into the team composition, are there any weak points, i.e. do people need extra mentoring or support? Is everyone confident and happy, or do they need a little extra time and attention to properly absorb the level of risk that they're taking on? Last slide, please, Rosie. So methods of profiling, there are 2 ways to look at this. You have an active method, which is what we tend to use at Spearfish, so gathering information on a case-by-case basis. An example is a trip risk assessment form that we use before someone deploys. It asks for all sorts of different information from them, such as team composition, nationalities, activity to be carried out, mobilization plan, local contacts, etc. And we pull all of this together and score this against risks that we see as relevant to the trip based on our knowledge of the environment. And we can build a really good risk assessment, but it is time critical. It's normally carried out 3 days before the trip itself. So you must be able to access accurate information in a relatively short timescale, and also have the full profiling information from the client. The second area is passive. So this is inference from personal information, photos, passport scans, social media, etc. We tend to do this informally based on the information that we've been given as part of the travel approval process, but we don't tend to store or analyze. We don't look at social media profiles or try to gather historical information, but I think there will be merit in developing this line of inquiry, providing it's given freely and for the purposes of keeping people safe. Ideally, what we want to end up with is a blended approach, so consensual use of given information purely for the purposes of risk assessment, mixed with open source and company information that we use to validate and expand our understanding of who someone is and how they might fit into a certain set of risk factors. So, in conclusion, whatever we do, we need to have a clearly understood framework for the profiling and the purposes behind it. We need output for risk assessment only, with the necessary controls in place. There's plenty more to be done in this area. It's relatively unexploited, but has great potential in terms of localization and also providing context-specific risk management. I know Rosie will mention this at the end, but we are involved in a project with Innovate UK and Southampton University, as well as our local business in Nigeria, to develop better digital tools to really understand and leverage profiling. However, unless staff want to buy into this, to take advantage of it, then it will never proceed past a certain point. So it has to be done as a collaboration between company and individual, all individuals, and be focused solely on keeping people safe. So that's all I'm going to say. I shall pass back to Rosie, and then happy to take questions at the end after Kabir's session. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Dan. I'll now hand you over to Kabir. Kabir is Managing Director of Beacon Consulting Limited, a renowned firm providing enterprise risk and security management solutions in Nigeria and the Sahel region. Kabir is a dynamic and professional security and intelligence specialist with a sound track record in public and private, including humanitarian and development sectors. He's experienced in security consultancy and project management at the multinational level and has supported clients with operations in hostile, challenging and complex environments. Kabir also regularly appears on national and international media. So Kabir, when you're ready, I'm going to stop sharing screen now.
Thank you very much, Rosie, and good afternoon all. I'm delighted to be here and part of this panel and to be opportune to speak on this topic, which I think as the two previous speakers have mentioned, it's a burgeoning topic, receiving a lot of attention, but just like Dan has concluded, would require additional support, as it were, both from the employer as well as the employee point of view. My input would be to talk a little bit about how profiling, risk profiling, and the security management functions have interplayed in the Nigerian context. And I'll specifically be speaking about two regions in Nigeria, the Northeast as well as the Northwest region. I'm sure most of the attendees here have a little bit of background knowledge about developments in Nigeria, but perhaps maybe others not. So I'll do a little bit of background about happenings in these two regions, and then I'll tie it in with the topic that we're discussing. Now, starting with the Northeast, for about 12 years now, the Northeast of Nigeria is faced with a terrorism challenge. It started with a group called the Jamaat al-Ahl Sunnah lil-Dawat wal Jihad, which is a Islamist jihadist group that had its headquarters first in Borno State and then in Yobe State, and now it's spread across almost the entire Lake Chad basin. It has led to the displacement of roughly, depending on what statistics you're using, between 3.5 to 5 million persons. And then again, depending on what statistics you're using, the death of between 27 to 30 million persons in the space of this 12 plus years. Now, as a result of both the humanitarian and development needs that the impact of this terrorism has created. We've seen a huge influx of both national and international NGOs whose primary kind of objectives would be the provision of humanitarian services and in certain contexts, development assistance. Part of the challenges that these NGOs have faced is one that revolves around access. And when I come to tie the topic of our discussion, I would explain how profiling, risk profiling has in a way supported security management functions in the Northeast for both national and international both humanitarian and development organizations. Now to the northwest of Nigeria, the challenge is almost similar. It's a conflict that is essentially resource-based between two communities, Hausas and Fulanis. And I think that kind of brings us squarely to the issue of identity. The crisis started roughly about a decade ago, and it started as a simple, traditional age-old conflict. Now has grown into different ramifications. The traditional conflict, inter-community conflict, is there. Then there's an aspect of banditry where you have groups that have more or less become outlaws and challenging the supremacy, the authority of the state, and are ravaging communities, raiding one community after the other, irrespective of what the inclination, whether religious or ethnic inclination of that community. The raid does not make that any differentiation. And then you have the criminal groups who both together with the bandit groups engage in kidnap for ransom and some other criminal activities. And then of course, you've got the armed conflict between these groups, these non-state actors, and the security forces in the state. There is also a difference between the federal government approach to addressing this challenge in the Northwest, as well as the challenge in the state level approaches at the state government level. Nigeria operates a federal system. So the federal government has certain responsibilities while the state government has. So what we're seeing recently is some differences between how the federal government is approaching and how the state government is also approaching the issue. In the Northwest, I would like to highlight a particular development which just happened last week, which would showcase this issue of identity and profiling from the point of view of the government, and of course how it would impact risk management for international and both national organizations, non-governmental organizations particularly. So last week, a particular community decided to turban one of the bandit leaders as with some form of recognition. And incidentally, that bandit leader is being wanted by the police for banditry in a neighboring state. And of course, this has generated a lot of attention. But the response of that community has been, he, quote unquote, accepted an amnesty program by the state government. And so his action has led to relative peace within that community. Now that bandit leader represents a particular ethnic grouping, which is the Fulanis. And like I mentioned at the beginning, the root cause of the crisis in that region is essentially a conflict between two ethnic groups, the Fulanis and the Hausas. And so that particular action has generated a lot of discourse, especially from the federal government and to an extent the state government. It has suspended that particular traditional ruler, and the police at the federal level and in the neighboring state has declared that that particular bandit leader is wanted. Now, to tie all of this with our discussion, which is risk profiling and duty of care, especially in complex environment, undoubtedly these two environments that I've described complex operational environments for any organization. And like I mentioned at the beginning, understanding the risk profiles of especially employees has helped organizations that are operating in the Northeast and to an extent in the Northwest in managing the security requirements, in particular access. So in the case of the Northeast, the predominant membership of the terror groups that are operating there are of a particular ethnic grouping. They have also targeted almost directly, first off, development and humanitarian workers. And what they have done is to kind of provide an identity, what they feel is an identity of who an NGO worker or development worker is, which they commonly call Red Cross, by the way. And that identity usually would be a young person, male or female, carrying a rucksack. And in most instances, because they believe one of the primary objectives of this organizations is proselytization of, especially of the Christian faith. So that kind of specific targeting goes on there. And of course, for security management functions, understanding this and training staff to not just present that identity, as well as to avoid exposing, even if, for instance, they are of that faith or they represent that identity, it would in the first place allow them access. And secondly, it would also reduce the possibility of them being targeted. Now, in my experience, most development organizations and humanitarian organizations have done this quite exceedingly well in the Northeast. The challenge, however, has been what I think Tara highlighted at the point, the existence of what one can describe as more or less a monolithic profile for some of these organizations. Because as an example, sending a female staff of a particular ethnic group of particular religion to some locations would more or less expose her to the threat from this particular group. And so you've seen a predominance where in certain interventions where female staff of that particular religious group are required, they're not able to be deployed, no matter the level of protection that to a reasonable extent that can be provided for them. So this has kind of played out in the Northeast. In the Northwest, unfortunately, despite this predominance of an understanding of the profiling and how it affects security operation, we haven't seen the few non-governmental organizations that are operating there embracing this component. Now, I must mention that this conflict that I've described is very well underreported and unfortunately not well understood. So that may explain this inability to, by the few organizations that are operating there, to embrace this component as an additional tool for risk management in the location. But suffice to say, in my experience in both locations, the security management functions have embraced to a larger extent the requirement for deploying, especially risk profiling, components in their requirement for access, as well as for managing the risk associated with their responsibilities in those locations. So I'll stop here, and perhaps in the roundup, if there are questions, I'll take them up. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kabir. That was really interesting. Okay, so as we've got a few minutes now, I'm going to open it up to the floor. There's already been some quite interesting questions that have come through. The first one, one for you, Tara. How can organizations balance risk profiling in terms of race and equal opportunity within an organization? Although security should take priority, but should this be considered in any organization's employment? And I'm looking at Tara, but Dan, Kabir, feel free to jump in as well.
Thanks, Rosie, and thanks for that question. I think, my answer is I'm not an HR person to start with. However, I think all, risks and intersectionality considerations should be considered based on, first, you need to profile and risk assess the role. And in doing so, you're going to enable a conversation to be had with with staff who will understand how their profile might match that role. And you're going to allow for kind of that self-identifying of some initial risk. But organizations need to take it upon themselves to have conversations with staff who are best qualified for those positions based off of the different risk factors. And I think you have to take into consideration one's personal reflections on that and how they manage their risks and how organizations can support staff in doing that. So I think it's a bit of a conversation that must be had. So first you have to risk assess the role and making sure that your organization knows what you're trying to achieve. And then in doing so, you'll be able to attract the right staff to that and support the staff based off of their intersectional needs through actually speaking with them.
Excellent. Dan, would you agree with that?
I think so. I mean, I see what we do very much a supporting function within the business. You need to have the right people in the business for the skill sets, knowledge, and experience that you need. And to me, then what we're doing from a security and risk management perspective comes up as a supporting element to that. And you put in place the right structure around that individual, depending on what the risks are to them and to the business. So probably business first, with security or risk management supporting as a close second.
Okay, excellent. I think you've already answered this, but just to maybe sort of reiterate it, there was a question about handling the risk profiles. I can see there being issues with scaling here. If you have dozens of trips globally per day, it becomes a real challenge to do the tailoring and deep dive necessary for risk profiling. How would you address that? I don't know if you just wanted to embellish that a bit more.
Yeah, absolutely. So from Robert. So thank you, Robert. Yeah, excellent question. We normally work on a 3-day or 72-hour lead time for a trip risk assessment. The assessment will normally take us a minimum of 2 to 3 hours, depending on where it is and what information we have. So if you only have, a team of 20, there's only so many you can get through to maintain the required standards. So I think this is where people like Innovate UK, Southampton University, tech partners do come into it and have something to offer. They can provide digital tools, whether it's use of data, use of machine learning or artificial intelligence to force multiply. But what you can't do is take the person out of the loop. You still need an advisor at the center of the web, looking at the risks coming in, making a decision, and then communicating that to the person who is the recipient in the field. So yes, the people will always be a limiting factor unless you're building something that takes the person out of it. But to me, then you lose value. You just become really a sort of cookie cutter, more generic type of risk platform. So I think that the trick is to work out how you can scale it. So an individual advisor could take on as much as he or she can do within reason, but still make the right decisions. And there's a little bit of fat, a bit of resilience in there. So they do have some extra capacity to react to fastballs, crises, etc.
Brilliant, thank you. So I don't know if anybody's got any more questions they've got for the panel, or if the panel just want to jump in and finish anything off or comment on the other two.
Yeah, let me come in, Rosie. The point made by both Dan and Tara, I think one thing that we've observed here in Nigeria is the lack of synergy between the functions of the security department and the HR department. And I think both, we've kind of emphasized the need for a synergy of these functions. They can complement each other, and especially in this subject that we're discussing, having a HR that sees the role of the security department as complementary, especially in identifying and advising the right type of deployment, and of course lowering the risk for specific individuals would definitely help the organizational objectives. So that's something I'm hoping to see, in terms of both the training and advocacy from different security management platforms. Thank you.
Perhaps just to develop that from my perspective, we do see, let's take Nigeria, for example. In our team over there, the vast majority of people that we're supporting in the field are from Nigeria. They are Nigerian consultants or employees of INGO or development sector operations. So, the risk assessment piece normally is to a fairly good standard. I think where we struggle sometimes is having the budgets to either allocate time for training, taken some time out of a program in inception to budget for either heat or security awareness, because that is a cost, both in time and money, but also resources you can deploy to people when they're in the field, whether it be going to a slightly better level of driver, vehicle hire company to give them a slightly better method of protection on the roads, or if they're going to an area of critical risk, something like either mopol or other some sort of security asset that they might need with them. So the assessment piece, I think, is reasonably well handled. It's more about the so what do you do with the results of that, and have the resources been allocated at the start of a program or project to allow you to then deploy a proper platform. And we do see gaps in that.
Thanks, Dan. There's a couple of really interesting points that's come through. One from Shane: more in-country organisations we are finding when doing due diligence, they have no insurance for their staff, and or we live and work here, so we understand the risk. Just a point, as they want to work, I understand, but they still need to encompass the security and the duty of care for their people, not just big organisations. Really interesting point. And then another one, risk profiling, often traditionally associated with police work. When we started working on person-centered approach, it was about ensuring that profile-specific risks were integrated into the risk assessment process and help inform not only mitigation measures, but also HR deployment needs. Just a thought on whether we should be reconsidering the use of that term that may be perceived as negative, which is something that does come up quite a lot. So really interesting comments.
I have to admit, sorry, Tara, do you want to jump in on that?
Go for it, go ahead.
Okay, so when writing my talk and continually repeating the word profiling, it felt exactly that way. Is this the right word to be using? I think it's good because it does communicate what we're trying to get across to people and to talk about. But Jean-Philippe, absolutely, there are negative connotations. Sometimes just by mentioning the word, you instantly put people on guard and perhaps put them off the subject, where if you just talked about a trip risk assessment when you're doing profiling, but actually don't specifically mention it, then that's what we tend to do. So yeah, there might be a bit of an own goal there, but I think it's important to at least have the conversation. And then just to Shane's one on insurance, again, we see gaps in insurance with different people, for international and for local staff. Sometimes it's harder for an organization to get good insurance at country level, but there's always a way. So again, it's just time and effort and saying, right, we're going to cover people to this standard. We need to actually go off and do the work, and there's a cost associated to it. But yes.
I just wanted to jump in and thank you for that, Dan. And I think your comments are right on in that. I agree with what Jean-Philippe has written, that we really do need to rethink about these terms. But there's a lot of terms I think also that we may socialize in the sector that probably need to look. We won't get into them today, but I agree that I think it has to be. We have to move more to this person-centered approach and really thinking about the language used, because you don't want to alienate the very people we're trying to protect. So really, really happy to see that comment, because it resonates very much so, I think, with where we are today and where we need to go. And yeah, I'll leave it there.
Okay, great. I'll just along those same lines, just like a final comment. There's an argument that the term risk is not appropriate here, as technically it is a vulnerability assessment, as the probabilities are indeterminate for human actors who have intent. I don't know, Tara, if you just want to kind of comment on that briefly before we wind things up.
I don't know if Kabir or Dan have other comments on this one, because I think they may have some interesting perspectives there. But I think, I understand that comment, and I think I can definitely have some synergies there. I think the term risk is a bit delicate because of the fact that for some, there is something very specific about risk. But I think it all is context based, and I definitely agree with the use of vulnerability, because that's what we're trying to understand, is what individuals' vulnerabilities are. And so I do think we may need to look at how we use certain language in the sector. So also another really good comment made there.
Yeah, I would just want to say, unfortunately, this is quite common within the security industry, where unfortunately we've not really come to terms with some terms, and oftentimes the usage of those terms generate this type of discussions. But again, I think it's from discussions like this and feedback that we would improve the industry, and exactly, I think this is what's happening at the moment. So thank you for that comment.
Brilliant.
Yeah, I don't have much to add. I mean, my focus is a reasonably narrow focus, perhaps a simplistic focus, but it's all about keeping people safe, looking at the risks, working out mitigation plan, and putting in place the support. So yeah, semantics aside, that's our sort of narrow focus here, and you know, we may not always get the terminology right.
Brilliant. Okay, well, I think that takes us up to the hour. So there's a lot of great theories out there, but we can always things can be done better. Risk profiling is a relatively unfinished area of security. And for that reason, Spearfish have started, as Dan mentioned, funding a project by Innovate UK in partnership with Southampton University to develop better digital tools and profiling techniques. So if you want to know more about this or any of the services or any of the topics that we've talked about today, please do not hesitate to get in touch. Finally, it just leaves me to thank our excellent panel for their thoughtful and interesting presentations, and of course you, the audience, for your time and contribution this afternoon. So thank you and goodbye.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks all. Bye.
Thank you so much.